Welcome back to the Today Dreamer podcast. My name is Michael. As always, I'm your host, and the show here is really just to explore conversations that will help us all cultivate our practice of presence and integrate dreaming and doing into being in service of the blossoming of an emergent world story. Let's participate in what's emerging together in a meaningful way. Today's guest on the show is Guy Sengstock. We're going to be talking about circling, and Guy discovered circling quite a while ago, around 98 or 2000 if I'm not wrong, where him and a friend of his, they both kind of looked at each other after a profound, intimate session of human connection, and in that moment, something new was born and discovered, and from then forward for the last 20 or so years, they've been exploring that space of intimacy in a group setting. So that's what we're going to be diving into today. What is circling? And what does it mean to really listen to being? To really listen. Yeah, let's get into the conversation. Before we do though, I'd just like to throw this out there. If you feel as though you're getting something special out of the conversations and it's helping you and you're able to apply some of the insights and deepen your state of presence in life, then please consider deepening your journey with the show by being an active supporter. You can do that by heading over to patreon.com/todaydreamer and becoming part of the tribe, and there'll be certain perks and gifts available to you for doing so, depending on the level that you all feel comfortable pledging. And there's other ways to support the show as well. Feel free to share it with some friends. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, leave a review if you haven't already. It always feels really good when I receive feedback via comments or emails. So connect in any way you can. But yeah, let's get into the conversation with Guy. I really felt something special was born within me through this conversation, and I'm sure the same thing will happen to you. Let's take a moment to take a deep breath together, come into a moment of pause, a moment of stillness amongst the chaos of our lives, and drop into kind of a shared space a little bit deeper together now before moving into the conversation. So I'd just like to invite you to find a comfortable position, and when you're ready, bring your eyelids to a gentle close. Take one big inhale in and exhale out. Into the nose, deep into the belly, and release. Now let's do that again, but this time, see if you can make your inhale as slow as naturally possible. And whenever it is that you reach the peak, take your time with it and just pause there for a moment. Feel into that space before exhaling just as gracefully on the way out and pausing at the bottom. Let's go. Okay. There she is again.
Yeah, the state.
Yeah.
letting us know what's so.
yeah, just that little reminder. So we were just discussing this reenactment of a coming to. So please correct me if I'm wrong with this, because I think it's probably good for me to try to put it into words and then see where I land with it, just out of curiosity.
Mhm.
But from what I understand, there would be a process where a group of individuals would get together. I'm not really quite sure how these people came to be where they were, but they would discuss ideas and almost in a way challenge one another's ideas consciously and purposefully in order to get to a new place that none of them were at or could possibly get to on their own. Is that something like even that painting behind you in a sense, or is that kind of what you guys were doing?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, well, if you think about it, if you think about the word philosophy, right? Philia, it comes from the two words combining philia, Sophia. Philia being the love of fellowship or friendship. And philia, I'm sorry, philia, Sophia means wisdom. So it's exemplified, right, in the Platonic dialogues is this deep kind of fellowship, if you will, this deep communion in some sense, a deep kind of intimacy, such that 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 reached into and opened up to wisdom, right? And it's specifically, it's right in the word philosophy. And I have to say that in a certain sense, that word I think means a lot of things for people, but it usually doesn't mean something like intimacy, right? But it's embedded in the word, so there's something inherent to, I would say, wisdom as such, and that there's a way that in some sense, as Socrates talked about, in some sense, was a midwife, right? So there's a way in which you could midwife or draw out wisdom, right, from a person, but then from each other, and then there's this third factor emerges that's very difficult to put into words, but it's something like wisdom, right? And then when that happens, the idea is that essentially then that very fellowship, that sense of philia, becomes a wise thing to do in itself, right? And you can feel that reciprocal opening that starts to happen. And that's really like that's that kind of fellowship, that kind of exploration, or that kind of connection is really what we've been doing and developing in circling, which is something I co-founded, right, in 1998. And essentially that's that kind of deep intimacy that you have in friendship or in fellowship. That's not necessarily sexual, it's not familial, but it's this deep way in which we kind of give birth to each other, right? We draw each other out. We realize each other through the dynamic of the I thou encounter, right, as a group. And I think that is so deep at the heart of our whole Western tradition, and a forgotten part. And I think it's really exemplified in the Platonic dialogues. And in some sense, you could say that, in those very dialogues, and what was birthed there, I mean, there definitely wouldn't be the West without those, right? They're like, it's at the source of what makes everything intelligent for us in the way that it does. It's still super alive, right? But all of that really was indistinguishable from a deep, deep kind of relationship.
Yeah, it seems like a very exciting thing to be bringing back that in a sense, even though you've been doing it for quite some time now. And I've got this wondering around the setting up of that space. Like how do you arrange things, or what's been I guess the evolution of learning about this and setting it up and encouraging it and invoking it for you over the years, and like how do you even begin to bring this into being in an intentional way? Because it seems like it's something that there's like there's a beauty to it, and like you said, a lot of it can't be put into words, but how do you coax it out into being? That's what I'm wondering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Well, a few things. One thing to get about circling, right, is it's something that literally emerged. Like no one had any intention to invent some process, right?
Mm.
Or to invent circling. It was more like an experience we had. I mean, specifically the experience we had in Burning Man in 1998 with me and a group of my friends. There was some like tension and conflict, and I kind of like we ended up in a circle, and I just got interested in the conflict. And then we were there 12 hours straight. Time flew by, and we had this incredible, profound experience together, right? Of just opening it up and kind of this deep, I would say even transpersonal kind of experience of relationality or intimacy. It was like deeply personal, but beyond, through the personal, beyond something much deeper or higher, if you will. And afterwards, Jerry and I went, what was that? I remember we both pointed back to where we were, right? That's after we kind of came out of that experience, and we just spontaneously shook hands and just committed to whatever it was. All we knew is that that thing that we were pointing back to was something was profound in a way that was unlike all the other profound things we were involved in at the time. I could say it like that, right? And so, and that was just the beginning. And I think a few months later, it got the name circling. I barely even remember how it got the name circling, other than we meet in a circle, but it was more than that. And then lots of people started gathering around it, a whole community, and an organization was formed, and courses and like training programs and retreats, and it just kind of, and it pretty much like now it's all over the world, right? This thing called circling. And that kind of bottom up kind of emergence experience has been how circling has worked itself out into becoming what it was, right? So we do things through that experience. I started noticing patterns, right? For the longest time, we didn't really know exactly what we were doing or how we did what we did. I remember when we did our first training program was the first time I realized that Jerry and I had no idea. We had no idea how we did what we did. We just did it. And then we had to teach it. And then we realized, like, I have no idea how we do it. Right. And so we just circled the hell out of them for 2 years, you know, and wish for the best, which worked pretty good, I have to say. But then, you know, as time went on, I started to notice that there was definite patterns, right? And this is not easy to do, is to take something implicit and make it explicit. It's not very easy to do, to kind of track, right, your intuitive sense that develops in a relationship with something over time. So that's been a kind of a process of discovering through listening to it, through engaging in it, right? And, you know, over time, we've started to develop distinctions around it. So like when we set up circles, right, we talk about, you know, the deepest context. I often talk about like the paradigm of circling, right? Or the deepest, you could say, context that's underneath everything. Like it's the reason why we circle, it's what we practice when we circle, it's the place we come from, is essentially has to do with having a profound relationship with our experience, right? And I would say, to talk about the paradigm that I think is maybe opposite of that, that's kind of like a lot of us, you know, most of the people in America that I know, myself included, that were kind of raised in, was something like our relationship to our experience was more like we more have a relationship to what our preconceived notions about ourselves and other people and what the world is. And we usually try to relate to our experience as the thing trying to get our experience to fit into our preconceptions about ourselves, right? Like what we should feel and what we should be and what we should want, and and try to get you and your partner to their experience to have the experience you want them to have. And right? and so you can say that, like, circling has the almost the opposite paradigm of that, where instead what we're doing is we're deeply attuning to what is, right? What unfolds through your experience, right? And listening to it, encouraging it, tending to it in such a way that we kind of discover who you are, we discover who each other are, we discover what the world is through our experience. And that's basically the thing that we're practicing, right? Is diving into what's really happening in the moment, right, with each other right here and right now, and listening to it deeply, and in some sense, um, essentially having that be the authority, having that teach us what reality is, right? And so that kind of being the underlying context, and then we set some agreements, and we set some agreements about, we have, you know, three basic agreements, which is like really honor each other's dignity. And the other one has to do with really owning your experience when you communicate, rather than trying to control the outcome, like share with the intent to relate, which usually when we do that, like when we're really honest and share our in the moment experience, is usually we have no idea what's going to happen when we get done sharing it. Right? It kind of opens it up, versus when I kind of withhold, or I'm trying to, you know, make sure that you like me, or all these different ways that we try to control an outcome with speech. Instead, the commitment is, we all kind of agree to, is to share and disclose and own our own experience. And then the last one is a deep kind of listening, which I think is essentially just like Socrates and back in Greece, essentially like we're practicing a deep kind of listening to, in such a way that we agree to listen to each other's deepest humanity. And it seems like I can only listen to your humanity with mine. And so with those three agreements, then we kind of like set some context, and then sometimes we just kind of open up to whatever's most alive in the group, or somebody, or we bring our attention to one person, and we just start to dive into what's happening with them.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. It sounds like, let's set this up and let's see what happens, and then that's all part of it, right? And
Yep.
have you found that? Yeah, just curious how this is kind of, obviously this would have kind of bled into the way that you're living your life and the way that you're approaching every scenario. Just, do you have anything to kind of, does anything come into your heart or mind around that when I say that?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, it's like, I mean, I think I think the thing I've discovered through it is, in some sense, we can talk about like listening and speaking and behaving as like something, like an activity that we do, or a capacity that we have. But there's another way at a deeper level, where there is the listening in which I already am inside of, partaking of. There is the speech in which I, even when I'm silent, I am always in communication. There is a way in which I'm always in response, and even when I'm sitting still, to my environment and to the world, and I find myself already there. So I would say that that sense of finding myself already begun, already listening, is, I would say, has become the most constant experience of my life. It's like constantly listening to the sense of being with a sense of wonder. And, you know, it's like, I think through, you know, thousands and thousands of circles, right, over the years, you just like start listening this way, right? And you just really discover who people are, and watch people unfold in front of you, and participate in that, and be in that, and relate in that. It's like it changes you. It changes how you see everything.
Feels like it would have quite a big impact on the people as well. And it's this sharing and this kind of co-creation of something new, this co-being maybe would be a better way of putting it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And it seems like it's a beautiful thing that I've come across. I feel like at a beautiful time. It feels like a special area to be explored for me, I guess. And this is so fascinating and exciting. And I guess I've circled around circling for a while, but I've never actually gone inside. So
Right.
I really appreciate you sharing all this with me. It is fascinating. Yeah.
Totally. I mean, also another way to think about it, it's I think everyone probably can say that, if they think about their lives and they think about what are the deepest things that have impacted them, both positively and negatively. People are going to talk about their relationships, right? Like, it's like, people talk about, like, when you get to know somebody, usually at some point they kind of talk about all the girlfriends that they've had and all the like wives or husbands that they've had, and like how that's some pivotal point in which they saw themselves differently. Or like conversations, right? Like, I think a lot of people know this experience of like where they have a deep connection with somebody or have just a profound conversation where life's one way, and then they have this conversation and they walk out and then life's different from them, right? I would say circling is something like if you took the underlying transformative power of conversation, of relationship, right? Which is huge. Human beings are indistinct from our relationship with each other. Like, human beings only make sense, right, in a community. I mean, we're like pathetic if we're just on our own. We're like vulnerable and weak and small, but like it's only we really come alive, and ourselves only come alive in relationship, right? Through language and being with each other and dwelling with each other. So really, when we're talking about relationship, we're talking about the most developmental and transforming, you could say, agent that there is for us. So, surprisingly enough, though, it's so funny to think about this. Circling is one of the only things that I've ever been aware of that explicitly makes relationship and conversation a yoga, right? It's like the fundamental unit, I thou unit of relationship. I think circling is the first thing that is ever made that just explicitly looked at what's the yoga of that? What are the postures of that underline all profound conversations? And if you think about like, okay, if you took all those profound conversations in your life and you were just to abstract out like the postures and listening and speaking and behaving and being and attuning, and you just like made asanas out of those. Circling is basically like, just like you do in a yoga class, you just get together and you dive deep in these deep stretches and these deep asanas that give rise to those kinds of things. And then what ends up happening is you do that. And then just like when you're out of a yoga class after like, sweating your ass off, like hating downward dog and everything's burning and all the mind stuff that you got to do. And then when you're not that, like later that day, when you're not thinking about yoga at all, your relationship to gravity is more profound, right? Is more balanced. Your chest is more open, right? In just your responsiveness to the world, because yoga in some sense had you practice these extreme postures that are all postures that animate your relationship with gravity and with space. And so it's the same thing with circling. It's like people come and do circling for a weekend and they go home and they realize, they look at their wife and they realize they've never seen their wife. They're like, oh my God, I've never even known her. Like, she's amazing, right? I really listened to her. Because you're actually exercising these deep capacities that can really atrophy and get stuck.
Do you do something towards the end of a session that highlights or brings to life through language the change that everyone's experienced? Or is it's probably both, but I'm just wondering if there's like because it seems to be the case that I know when there's moments where I've felt this profound connection in relationship, I kind of think of it as like the the most potent moments of life in my life that I can kind of reflect back on, these immense moments, and they are always in this connection of relationship. There seems to be this gradual effect, I'll put it that way, or something that happens gradually that may not be straight away realized, you know, like maybe in the next couple of years, I'm like, wow, that just reflecting back, this is almost deepened over that time. Just wondering if there's something that's, because and then I'm realizing a lot of the time we don't see things that other people, it's a bit more obvious to others around us. So is there some kind
Right.
of a naming or a calling out or a sharing towards the end of the sessions that brings that to life and maybe even, you know, projects that process
Yeah.
into action?
Yeah. Well, I think you're naming something. Like in philosophy, they talk about philosophers. Like one of the functions of philosophers is is saving phenomena, right? Through bringing language to it. And there's this idea that like if something opens up and you're not able to articulate it and name it, right? You can't necessarily access it again, or it could completely disappear. So there's like, I think one of the big ways that, well, think about it like this, just like look at how your parents talk to you and just ask yourself how much did that affect you and who you are, right? Look at look at all the things that the ways they didn't talk to you, right? That maybe negatively impacted you, all the ways that they did talk to you that did impact you. Like there's a way in which I don't think we really, it's so hard to comprehend how much human beings are birthed out of and dwell in language. It is it is so hard to see that because it's so deep in us, right? Like we would not know who each other are, right? Just by ourselves. Like we come into being through being in the attention and the naming of another person. And I think, obviously when you're a little infant, and infants are like the most vulnerable living creatures that I think we know about. Like, and so obviously in early years, it's like deeply, deeply, you know, forming. However, I think on a pretty deep way, I don't think it ever stops. I don't think we ever stop being formed by our relationships. What's interesting right now, when we first kind of greeted you, I think we were talking about, it's kind of such a strange time that we're in, right? um I think part of the strange time is like technology, and this is part of the reason why I think circling really caught on and spread, is because it's it's a strange thing with technology. Like we're more connected than we've ever been, right? Like we have more ways to communicate with each other and be connected with each other than ever, radically, ever before. I mean, more than we can ever even use, right? Yet I think we're probably less related than we've ever been. John Vervaeke was telling me about some studies he had just read, some papers that he just read, that he said like friendships are completely on a downsurge. The amount of friendships people have is dropping, like, I mean, some astronomical amount, right? And it's so interesting because with all this kind of strange way that we're connected, it seems to be in a way that doesn't necessarily make us more related, right? And I think that's happening so fast that I don't even know that we understand or can even comprehend the consequences of that. But if you just imagine for a little bit of like what we've been talking about, how impacted you are just when somebody just like appreciates you, right? Or how hurt you are when somebody doesn't see you or acknowledges you or says something critical of you. Like that could make or break your week, if not your month, right? just a conversation with somebody that maybe even not that important to you. Like we are deeply impacted by relationships. So at a big level, I think that we're inside of something that I don't think that we understand, right? Around this. And so part of my in watching circling form, I think that it's forming, right? That there's such a thing like a yoga for the basic I thou relationship. I think is also informing of the world that we're in, and that there's a need for something like that right now, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I think what I was going to say earlier, and I think it kind of this leads into it quite well, actually, was this idea of you mentioned the like bringing the words, almost like allowing the words to cement something in space and time, in a sense. And there's almost something that the opposite of that is seems to be true as well. Like these moments seem to be
Mhm.
beyond words, and you share these moments, and there's this almost, I think maybe something would even be lost to convert some of them to language. Not that you even could in the fullest expression, but just like
Oh yeah.
the creating or the being within these moments beyond words, uh, just
Mm.
facilitating that process seems to be
Yeah.
exactly um, what brings us together, what heals, what allows us to come back into the present, what is
Right.
called for through this exponential acceleration in the other direction. It's almost like um, and like you mentioned, this came into being at the same time. So that's an interesting
Yep.
thing. There seems to be a
Yep.
sense of uh, polarity or yin and yang going on, you know?
Yeah. Totally. I think relationship is like well, I think there's actually, if we look at a little bit what's going on. I've done quite a bit of thinking about this, and I don't know if I'm right, but like my best estimation is it's kind of like when the before the industrial revolution, right? Life itself was hard, right? There's a lot of stuff you had to do, right, in order just to fulfill the ongoing functions of your life, right? You know, if you had to go to the bathroom, you had to dig a hole, right? You had to build your own furniture. You had to, there's all this movement, right, and activity with life. Then the industrial revolution comes along, and then they machines basically take a lot of that activity and they move the world into a small, small disk in front of us. And it's really interesting when you uncollapse or decouple movement from the fulfill like the functioning of your life. You uncollapse movement from that. Well, look, what happened is people started realizing there's this thing called physical fitness. Everyone started getting fat and like having heart attacks and right getting out of shape. And so it's interesting. That's so the notion of physical fitness and health and all these things come out of that change in basically uncollapsing life from its something that's deeply coupled from itself. And that led to things like that completely transformed our relationship to our bodies. We started to actually have to take up our bodies and take on and move it on its own. And then we created these weird things called gyms, right? Where you basically like concentrate gravity and you kind of pay money to go in and
Yeah, gyms are
move.
weird. Gyms are
And
really
it's kind
weird.
right? Totally, totally, right? And I think something is very similar that I think has gone under the radar around relationship. And it's this, like if you think about it, before the internet, before texting, right? Um, and I think probably the first version of this was with, in this way, was with the answering machine. If you wanted to talk to somebody, if you needed to exchange information with somebody, you at least had to call them, right? Like life itself, right, required and necessitated lots of conversation, right, just to function, right? You had to go to the store, you had to talk to the people, you had to like, it's like there's if you needed to, exchange, you couldn't do text, so you literally had to wait just to function.
Mhm.
And now there's texting and there's emails and there's all these kinds of things that make it a lot of convenient. But I don't think we really recognize that we also decoupled another thing, right? We made we decoupled basically informational exchange and from relationship, right? We could connect, uncoupled it from having to relate. And here's the thing, is relationship has always been terrifying. Like, you never know what you're going to say. It's fucking messy, right? Like, if you open up your mouth, like, you could say something, right? And if you open your mouth towards me, you could say something that could destroy my life and that I couldn't even predict it. You could say something that enlightens me. Like, there's so much ambiguity that you have to tolerate in the most simple, and lots of coordination in the most simple exchange, right? Now that we've uncoupled that and made that optional, the easiest thing to do, therefore the most sensible thing to do, is to send a text instead. And if you just quadruple that, then I think you end up in a situation where all of a sudden, like, people literally grow up without close friends, or their only friends, or the people that they're intimate with, are the people that they game with when they come home, right, from school. We have people growing up like that. So that I just have a feeling we don't really know what that's going to turn into, but I think it's really created quite a loneliness epidemic, but in such a way that, because it's so deep, I think it's a kind of loneliness that people don't even call loneliness, right? Because it's not like they had relationships and they're missing. We have people growing up that just don't have relationships. They're connected, but they're not going through the ambiguity and the messiness that it takes to have friendships, and the intimacy and the struggle and all of that. So in some ways, I think that circling in some way is similar to like the gym was, right, in the Industrial Revolution around movement. I think circling in some ways something very similar in terms of relationship.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I've been holding little hubs at my house where
Mm.
just kind of gather with people and we come into a state of presence together, and then we just share and listen to one another openly. And I've felt the same kind of thing. Like it's almost like real present being with one another in relationship has become stranger and stranger. Another example is I've recently, just in my own life, started dating again. Going on,
Mm.
yeah, I, I think I'm gonna delete these dating apps on my phone tonight, actually. But just going on the dating apps, it's like inviting people to a conversation and then having them say how strange it is to talk to someone is an interesting
Yeah,
kind of way to realize that same thing that you articulated. It's like
yeah,
it's strange to talk to a stranger on the phone, and it's strange to really talk to a lot of people on the phone, because everyone sends these messages where there's there is a kind of I don't know, like you don't get as much feeling from them. You don't get a glimpse
right.
into the person's vibe. You don't get to really understand where they're coming from, because it's literally just black and white, a few words on a screen, rather than the way their body language is, the way
Yeah,
their energy is. That's kind of beyond words, and then the way that in which they speak the words as well, and the tone in their voice, all that's gone. And
yeah,
as things speed up in a way that we won't even be able to imagine, well, we can't sort of imagine at this moment, continuously speeding up, and technology breeds more technology. Who knows where and how deep that goes? And to have a space created intentionally for the purpose of re-enlivening the beauty of relationship and connection, and all the beautiful properties that that brings about within us and around us, I think it's such a beautiful thing. And it's needed, but it's also like
yeah,
a natural thing, like we said, that emerges amongst, because it is needed, because it is kind
yeah,
of the counterpart that people, you probably, you've probably experienced this, but over the last 20 years, as technology has grown and other factors have come into play, obviously as well, um, that lead people to feel more and more disconnected and lonely, even though we live in these places with thousands of people around us. We don't know any of them. It seems as
Yeah.
though there's more of a receptivity to a real interaction, though. Like it's more potent. It feels more like, oh, wow, I didn't even know this was needed, but it obviously is a beautiful thing. It's a good thing. I can feel it inside me. I can feel it around me in the people and the expressions in the vibe. Yeah,
Mhm.
this is exciting stuff. Yeah,
Yeah, totally. And
yeah.
it's so interesting. I really hear you as we're talking about. I hear you kind of, in some sense, it's interesting how interestingly fast these changes are happening. And what's interesting about technology, and Heidegger really talked a lot about this, that part of the technological, and what he would say, and this is kind of complicated, but what he would say is that it's really not technology per se that's the issue that he was talking about, but that it's really is that we've adapted a technological understanding of being as such. We kind of see being as kind of information to utilize, extort, optimize, program, right? In terms of consumption and efficiency. And that we don't do that just with our objects, but we actually think of ourselves as things to optimize, right? Like people as resources, like the human resource department. Such a strange name when you think about that, right? Like you're a resource that I'm gonna optimize and get the most out of, right? These things have just become kind of the structures of intelligibility. And that's what he was pointing to. He's like, he called that, and this is really telling, he called that the culmination of the forgetfulness of being, right?
Yeah.
The
Mm.
right. And so when you bring people over and you just have them over, first of all, it's an interesting instinct. Let's just have some people over and just sit down and just get present. That's rare, right? And that's maybe awkward or strange or unusual, right? It tells you like, well, what are you coming out of and coming into? What are you coming out of when you're
Mm.
coming into relationship that's strange? What is it strange in relationship to what? And so what he would say is that the danger with technology is that it it is it it's really uncanny, but its uncanniness is concealed. So as we're talking, right, I'm talking about these things that when you look at them and you really think about it, you're like, whoa, this is really strange, right? Like we're like people aren't having friends anymore. Like, oh, we don't talk to each other anymore. Like, but we're finding ourselves having that already happening, right? In some way, and that it's invisible to us. But I really do feel like, and there's other ways, right? Obviously, to deeply connect in an untechnological way. But there's definitely when it comes to really having genuine friendship and genuine connection with, in the most simple way, with two human beings, that's something that I don't think you can do that through optimizing or extracting from one another. Something that cannot be, you cannot get that from an app per se. That's got to be as Buber would call, or Buber, that has got to be a genuine encounter. And I would say that it's synonymous with, you know, to be with you is to be and dwell and hear and encounter your presence, right?
Yeah, for no other reason other than to just do it and be in that space. There's no kind of,
Exactly.
yeah, there's no agenda there.
Right.
Mm.
And that's also a big part of circling, is like that's one of the things is we let go. Our agenda is to have no agenda, and the intention is just simply to be profoundly with what is, not to solve any problems, not to heal any wounds.
Yeah.
If all that stuff happens, right, which it does happen, right, it can be deeply therapeutic, but it's the intention is just simply to profoundly be more profoundly with what is as it is.
I've got this question arising, and it's around this bridge, the bridge between the worlds of the stepping into that space from or after being so used to or conditioned or just swimming in the other kind of space, and um, almost like how to build that bridge, or the process that you've may have discovered or are probably still discovering around that. I've noticed there's this, just kind of watching a few videos online, there seems to be a vulnerability that is welcomed, and a safety that is kind of that is created, a feeling of safety. But like getting to that point is an interesting thing for me. Just curious around that, and this idea of just little things I've noticed, like repeating back what you've heard in the way that you've understood it, and I've even noticed in some of my interactions, I'll go to give advice to someone, and this is something that came up a little while ago, and I just really noticed it as a thing to flag, and then realizing that that's probably not the best move in that moment, and the best move would be to almost like just sit in the space and hold the space and allow that co-exploration to take place, rather than like a giving an answer to something, or
Yeah.
taking some kind of a position. So
Yeah.
these are some little elements I've noticed, but are there any others to kind of to make that
Mhm.
bridge, or do you have anything to share about anything
Yeah.
in that area?
Well, it's funny, and I'm gonna put a caveat around this because it's really strange. Because there's things that we can talk about like that, right? Things to do and like and they're useful, they're practical. But here's the thing, though,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
This is it's like, I mean, ultimately, all of those things only make a difference to the degree that you're attuned,
mm,
right? And I think fundamentally that's the thing you know that's the thing that if you're attuned, right? What do I mean by that? I mean this kind of like like um almost nonverbal sense of tuning into you and tuning into myself and tuning into the time and the environment and the mood, almost like you're almost like there's a when you chant together, like there's that moment where you sync up with everybody's a certain note and you can feel it. In some sense, like awareness or listening or sensing is like you can attune to the relationship, you can attune to the environment, you can attune to what your listening is like, right? What mood you're in, what mood I'm in, what kind of space that we're in, what country we're in. All of these things are things that on some level you can develop your capacity to read and attune and to have like a non-conceptual sensibility about. And as long as that's there, your response will be appropriate, right? Even your mistakes or your mess ups will still be in attunement, right? And so, and anything that you do around listening or speaking, if they're effective, what they'll do is they'll just deepen attunement on some level. So there's not like rules or anything, and there are things to do. So I would say like, yeah, for example, one is kind of like when somebody talks about an issue or a problem, right? That's one of the big things that people find out in circling right away is like we don't do that. And the moment you put a restraint around that, right, it's the moment people realize that's all they do in conversations. They never even realized it. Like all they've done is try to like they listen for problems, try to solve problems to be useful, right? And on some level you can feel the positive intent underneath that, but you can also feel the anxiety underneath that, right? And so a lot of this has to do with like really learning how to like feel deeper than your own anxiety and your own social pressures and attune into the moments and where you're at. And like a lot of times when somebody like shares a problem, you can listen to the problem, but you can also imagine what it's like being them with that problem. what it must be like for them, right? And I bet if you kind of imagine that, you could probably make sense out of that. And if you do, you could be like, oh yeah, like I imagine. So you're looking at this thing. This thing's hard to figure out, and this thing keeps happening. Is that hard? And you could just ask a question about it, right? And invite, invite more of what's so for them about what it's like being them, caring about the world that they care about, having a problem like that, right? There's so like the endless complexity and levels of depth and context and meaning for that person that it takes for them to have that particular thing be salient enough to be talking about with you. There's so much depth there that is endless. It's endless in complexity. So it's like if you kind of relax into there and just kind of go start making sense of their experience, and then just ask them questions about it and let them know that you want to know more.
Yeah. This sense of attunement, when you mentioned that, I just felt like almost like an explosion in my heart. I feel like in the past, when I've been off with the attunement, there's almost like a sadness that's washed over me.
Yeah.
Almost like this, it's like a jerk back in the other direction. Like, nah, yeah, that wasn't, that didn't feel like it resonated with what was going on. And I'm conscious of time here, and I just wanted to see how much time you did have before we kind of, if we went any deeper with this inquiry. But I was,
yeah, I can just take a look here. Keep talking now. I'm listening.
I was just, yeah, wondering about this attunement and about this process of fine tuning it. And I'm sure, like you said, there's a lot of complexity that comes into every unique moment, and it's really situational. But there's also, I'm sure, a sense of, I don't know, like, is there one way, does that just naturally unfold as experience grows, or is there a way to, are there some little things that you've noticed on your journey that have helped you attune? Are there moments that you might want to share about that process or what you've experienced? Maybe a story comes to mind. I don't know.
Well, I always say that right where you felt it in your heart, it's really telling of what attunement's all about, right? It's essentially, especially if you think about like a classical example of somebody who's deeply attuned is, so for example, my wife is pregnant. We're expecting like next week.
Oh, that's exciting.
She's
Yeah.
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 She is bigger than she can even manage, right? In her
Yeah.
belly. It's really great. But you know what's going to happen is she's going to be so attuned to that child. Like everything about that child, her world is going to be for probably the next, to some degree or another, for the next 4 or 5 years, right? She's going to be, everything's going to be so deeply attuned to that child, right? Because biologically and so many other things, right? Her as an organism, right? Like the nurturing instinct, right? It's this kind of deep love that's this child's going to be growing up inside of with this mother. And I think essentially, I think that strikes us as like a model of attunement, right? Precisely because it's so centered in the heart and it has to do with caring. So I think that's the first step of like, if you want to be more attuned, the first thing to do is really start to get in touch with and cultivate a sense of deep care for people, right? And that's really, if you start to do that, right, you're, where you put your attention, how you move your body, how close you lean in, like all those kinds of things start to in some sense start to be evoked in your response, right? Of like, oh, I care about you, or I don't care about you, but I want to, or I want to feel like I care about you, and attending to that. So I think that the main thing with attunement is, on some level, the other thing you get to about attunement is that I mean, Heidegger talked a lot about this too, is that at a fundamental level, human beings are the beings who are attuned to the world. We're attuned to being, right? And so everything that we do is, we can't not be attuned, right? So we do know how to attune, but attunement is like this, you could say, is really has to do with attention. It has to do with opening your heart. It has to do with opening your pores. You can, you can almost feel you can also almost feel the kind of meditative sense of awareness is being cultivated, right? But I would say it's a little bit more starting from your heart, right? And really paying attention. We talk about something about being permeable, right? Like opening your pores to like what you're saying and like really letting what you're saying kind of penetrate, not just listening to the words you're saying, but like letting your being kind of penetrate and affect me, being open to be affected by me, right? And also being more and more transparent in how you're being impacted by the other person. Because it's, if you think about it, like, how do you know, human beings need to matter. It's the heart of meaning for us, right? It's like, we gotta matter. Well, one of the ways that we know that we matter is that we impact people, right? It's like, if what I say and do, if I can tell that it impacts you in some way that's, good or bad, right? That is deeply meaningful to me. That lets me know I kind of matter. So there's a way in which you're always, in some sense, and this is really surprising for people to really think about and start to practice, because it doesn't happen a lot, right? Which is just really practicing, one, attending to the way that you're impacting the other person, and also tending to how you're being impacted by that person, and then sharing it in just little ways, just mentioning it. Now, it's, again, has to do with attunement, because it's like what we practice in circling are these deep yoga stretches, right? We have lots of permission, right? And it allows us to go really, really deep. But somebody who's never done anything like that before, you don't want to just come across and be like, oh man, I really feel your heart right now, or whatever. They're going to be like,
Yeah.
You're going to be like, it's just not going to be attuned. So just meeting people where they're at, and then just feeling the contours of that, and then just sharing, like, for example, I've never met somebody that isn't just so damn peculiar when you really get down in there. Like, people are so bizarre, and they believe the weirdest things, and the way they make sense of the world is so fundamentally their own signature and so unique. I've never not found that to be the case when I've like really gotten to know somebody really deeply in that way. We're more peculiar than we understand, right? So people are always doing something that only they do, and they're tending to things that they're constantly doing things they don't have to do, but they're doing it because something's important to them. And if you tune into just all these little things that people do all day long, that's living into some possibility, or them tending to something, or the way that they move, like they wear their cowl, like they chose to do that, right? You can kind of like notice those things and just point to them and let them know that you got like, oh yeah, you see that. Like, what's going on with that collar? Like, how long did you think about that?
It's
Right?
nice feeling into being seen.
Yeah, totally. And people, if it's done respectfully and it's attuned, right? It's not too weird, right? To the circumstances. What starts to happen is people want to be seen. They love being noticed, especially when they're noticed for their peculiarity, right? Like, it really creates a kind of safety that can start to unfold and open a relationship. Yeah.
And open into
and I think that
I was just going to say that probably be able to open into a deeper understanding of themselves that way. Once they feel seen, they can open into this space where there's a lot more possibility.
Totally. Yep. And just for its own sake.
Yeah.
like what
Yeah.
you're doing, like what you're doing when you're having people. Like it's it I think just think it's like that is such a, and Buber really, really emphasized this. And he really said that he
Yeah.
said that the, you know, it's that those I thou relationships of like really seeing somebody as an end of themselves and wanting to encounter them and know them for not as a means to an end, but as an end in themselves, right? Those are those are the most impactful experiences and meaningful experiences of our lives, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Something comes to mind around this is just a moment, just a memory that came up. I remember being just traveling with my ex partner, and at one point I noticed something interesting happening. We're at a table with a bunch of other travelers, and I noticed myself being kind of bored, I guess, by the conversation, or almost catching myself feeling like I knew what was coming next and I knew all about their lives. And, the truth was I didn't. But I noticed her and the way she was almost like leaning in deeper into this sense of interest into their own peculiarities and their own uniqueness. And
Mm,
I couldn't figure out how she was doing it. I was like, I don't feel like being in these spaces. I almost feel uncomfortable in them because it's not
yeah,
invigorating or different enough or exciting or anything. It's just like I've heard this story over and over again. But for you, it's like something brand new. I'm like, how does that even happen? And yeah, I remember having this come up actually for myself. It's interesting you share that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Did did you ask her? Or did you ever discover what that was? How'd she do that?
I don't think she shared it specifically. I think it was just like an innate interest of hers. And now thinking
Yeah.
about it, it's something that, yeah, I don't know. It might have just been, I'm not really sure where that came from. And I noticed just
Mhm.
since that point, I think what you mentioned earlier around this idea of caring for the other person brings about this sense of interest, almost like not needing to be entertained for my own benefit or pleasure, but almost being inquisitive because I know that it would be good for the other person, and then the interest comes. Maybe there's something that they say that piques my interest or whatever, but I'm not trying to get the interest. I'm just trying to be there for them. I think that's
There you
where
go.
the difference has been from then and now.
Yeah.
So it does come
And
back to,
there,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
yeah. And that's a practice, right? You just outlined a practice right there. It's like, well, I'm not necessarily innately interested in the thing that you're talking about. In fact, I'm kind of bored. Okay, wait a minute, though. I'm just gonna, as a virtue, right? I'm just gonna practice like bringing my attention and interest, anyways, right? Just because we're here and you're here, and that's the virtue I'm gonna practice. And then sometimes it actually catches, right? Because the feelings and the interest, will catch on, and pretty soon you lost track of time, and and then you come to and you're like, oh wow, I guess where did the time go, right? So
yeah.
there is that quality of like, and I appreciate what you're saying, because you're really, when I hear in that, it's like just the sentiment, right, that you would do that or think that or notice that, right? I think is is an example of attunement. Like you got your eye on something, right? That you would notice the difference between your experience and hers and be impressed by her and be like, what's going on with that? Right? Like it it seems to tell me that you're like, not everyone would notice that, right? Not
Hmm.
everyone would like even notice that or pay attention to that. So even that expresses a concern or a care on your part for that to even show up for you, right? As something to pay attention to and notice, right?
Hmm. Yeah, we could go a lot deeper with this, but I'm still conscious of time. How are we looking? Talk to me.
I can, let's see, I can go until about 8:30 my time, so another 20 minutes, I
Oh,
think.
that's amazing. Yeah. When
Yeah.
you're saying that, I'm just kind of opening, since we're in this space together, I'm opening into this or trying to open into this sense of vulnerability myself, and probably sharing more than I normally would, which I think is a good thing. But I get this
Mhm.
feeling of, even when you said that, this feeling of like, it's a strange feeling that I feel washes over me when some kind of a praise happens, if that makes sense. Like you just mentioned, there's a sense of attunement there. And I think it seems easy to recognize when the attunement's not there, because like I said, it's a jerking motion, and it's like,
Yeah.
I notice a response in the other person, and it's like, oh, well, that wasn't nice, or that this felt a bit unnatural, would be a good way to
Mhm.
put it. Not really
Mhm.
in the moment. And then when you mentioned this kind of attunement that I did kind of display, I just felt this sense of, like it's a weird thing to hear a kind of a praise about yourself, because it's a weird thing to go into this sense of, yes, I'm so in tuned, and I kind of want to stay away from that area, because it's like
Mhm.
feeding something that I don't think is a healthy thing to feed. But then going deep
Mhm.
into the other side of like, um, oh, that's not, beating yourself down in some ways isn't right either. So it's a tricky thing, I think,
Mhm.
to stay in the middle while receiving praise.
Yeah. Well, actually, let's take a look at it. Like maybe what I said wasn't totally on the mark. Let's check it out. Is it? I think what I was noticing is seemed like even though you were talking about a moment that you weren't particularly attuned, you were talking about how you weren't really that interested in the person talking, but you noticed she was, and that caught your attention, right? That became salient for you. I mean, I was imagining that even struck you as something distinct and to pay attention to, that you even noticed it, seems to presuppose that you care about relation. You care about whether or not you're paying attention, whether or not you're attuned. For that to even show up as at all dissonant, or her doing something that you didn't have access to in that moment. Is that right?
Yeah, that feels right. But at the same time, I feel like there was a sense in that moment, if I'm reflecting back, of almost like I've had enough of feeling this way. It's like a wall that I hit of like, okay, well, this is happening quite often. This isn't the first time this has happened.
Right.
And there's that spark that's created between her and the other people that is a beautiful thing. It's a nice thing. It feels right. And it's not there when I'm sitting here. And the
Mm.
alternative is to break away and run away from it. And that didn't feel right. So it's just kind of like the inquisitive part
Mhm.
arose on its own, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It started having me. I noticed when you said that, I started having me got interested in. You said you were noticing that a lot, right, these days, or something like that.
Or there was a
Heard me
pattern
some.
before that of happened. It had happened before a few times. Like it wasn't the first time that it happened.
Right,
Mm.
right. What do you think's happening there for you?
Well, again, I think it was something to do with this there was an attraction to the excitement of a new experience of some sort that
Mhm.
didn't happen when I thought I could figure out where the other person was going, or if there was a common conversation that I'd heard many times amongst travelers, when
Yeah,
the standard kind of conversations that maybe aren't so present, and maybe they're just kind of going through the motions in a sense.
right, right.
Yeah, there's that dynamic, but there was also, yeah, this feeling of just wanting to be more interested, I guess.
Yes,
So wanting,
exactly.
maybe even wanting to
Mhm.
be different from what really was as well. I don't know.
Right, totally. Yeah,
Mm.
totally. Well, I'm also hearing in that part, but just like, yeah, you're kind of tired of hearing a certain kind of idle talk of some kind, or what struck you as idle talk. And
Mm.
you were a bit amazed of like how she could hold her interest on that, right? Like you're like, I'd like to feel, at least what I'm imagining is you like the aliveness that you probably sensed in her, that
Yeah.
you weren't necessarily feeling in that moment. But I also feel too, I can also get the sense of like, if you're traveling around and then there's Because there is this thing, and Heidegger talks a lot about this. You know, this is one of the things that human beings do is they idle talk, right? And he calls it, and there's a reason, and I think, you know, maybe you're attuned to this a bit, right? Because, you know, if you look at this, what you're doing on the show, obviously you're into authenticity. You're into being interested in being alive and what it is to be a human, and presence. And, you know, you have people on like me and meditators and spiritual teachers and all kinds of stuff that are all essentially about opening up to and not taking being for granted and being more and more aware of it. So, like, I could imagine um, the constant chatter and idle talk of I'm saying, right? And idle talk is just basically kind of using language to perpetuate a kind of idling, right? It just keeps, it just, I'm just saying what I'm saying because this is what I've always said, right? Like the gossip across the street, it's like the all of the automaticities, right? And it's kind of like I think about this, it just kind of keeps the time up in the air and it just keeps things going and it keeps the interpretations in, right? But Heidegger said that like it's also a way idle talk when that's the only thing that goes on. It ends up becoming an actual way of concealing and forgetting being. He says it can be an enactment of the forgetfulness of being as a kind of fallenness, as he would say,
So
right?
where
Like
do
an
you go with
existential
that
fallenness.
when that's happening in your sessions, for example, and you can feel that
Mhm.
that sense of that taking place? Do you allow? Do you step in and have you had anything? I'm sure that's come up for you.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. There's no formula around it,
Yeah.
right? So it's different every time. But usually, what ends up happening, at least in circling, right, is people start being impacted by it. People start getting irritated or uncomfortable, and like, and then they'll say it, right? They'll kind of own their experience, right? And it's usually some version of like, I want to feel you more, but like, you've just told me how much money you make and like what the neighbors just did, like I'm or whatever, right? And it's funny that kind of level, and this is something that you can always do, right? Is you can always be honest with people, right, about what's happening. um and that definitely brings, you know, we call that in circling, we call that the warrior stage, which is where is it's this, and we haven't talked much about this, but this is the part of circling, right? Where intimacy comes into the picture, you know, and how intimacy is created. And it's essentially, you know, it's like being different. Intimacy is something like this, something like really me being me and you being you. And we can choose to come together, right? And while being ourselves and different at the same time and stay deeply connected, right? Including me not liking you, including me, right? Like wanting more from you, including being afraid that you're not going to accept me, right? And that when we share the truth, however it is, and we can own it, usually intimacy is, you know, if you think about it like this, my friend Mark Lewis puts it like this. I think it's a great way of putting it. He's like, you know, of all the things that go through the human mind, right? What are those things that go through my mind that if I share them, it will invite something like intimacy to happen? And he said, it's usually like, well, it's those things that if I share them, right? And you reject me or don't understand me, I will in fact feel pain. If I share those things, right, that those are the things that open into intimacy. In other words, there's a kind of risk there, right? So and this has something to do with something really deep when you start to understand what's going on with intimacy, because it's like the two, and this is what comes up. And, if we think about also, I've seen it pictured before. I think it's a good, simple way of thinking about it. Like, each person is represented as a circle, and then there's like ever concentric circles, like layers, right? And there's layers of depth to each other. And when you get into a relationship, right, the relationship is, as it progresses, goes through these levels of depth of intimacy, right? And so with each stage, right, what you end up confronting is this. It's like, to be a human being is to embody two fundamental existential drives, right? On one level, to be a human being, right, is to want to belong to everything that's good, and cosmically merge in belonging with everything good forever, for all time, right? We want to belong, right, and be a part of, right, and deeply be secured in being a part of. And at the same time, to be a human being is we want to stand out, right, in you could say in our cosmic specialness. We want to stand out, like we have a last name that connects us to every other living being in the past and in the future, right? We have a first name that has us stand out, and we want to be valued for our unique specialness and our contribution, right, and our uniqueness. And so usually what ends up happening is intimacy, as you go through levels of depth, you hit these stages where it's like, oh shit, like if I'm really like, let's say I start to desire something, but I'm afraid that if I share it with you, right, you'll reject me and you won't want to be with me. So right there, I'm in a dilemma, right? Because if I don't share it, I may save the relationship, but I'll lose myself. But if I do share it, right, you may reject me and I'll lose the relationship, right? But I'll keep myself. So intimacy is usually has to do with you're right at the head of that risk. Like, you can just feel that. Like, anybody could feel that moment, right? We've all been in that moment, right? And I would say that I think we can say that, well, what will invite intimacy is actually to share it. And in sharing it, right, and taking that risk, right, I also can discover more about you and about me, and there's a possibility that we can actually go deeper, not just risk losing it, right? And in that sense, those moments can be deeply transforming, right? Because in sharing that, I may actually find out something about myself in sharing it that I'd never even understood until after I shared it, right? And I may find out something about you, right, in sharing that opens something up for you and you respond to me in some way that I couldn't have even predicted. Usually that's the kind of stuff that happens when you share like that. But that has everything to do with the ability to tolerate anxiety, right? Those moments like intimacy, and I don't hear this talked about a lot, right? Because usually you think about intimacy, you get this warm, fuzzy feeling. No, man, intimacy isn't warm and fuzzy. Like, it's anything, but it's a lot of things, but it's not safe. It's precisely risky, because it has to do with the two deepest drives that we have.
There seems to be a risk in both directions, though, not just on yourself. And this idea of softness comes up. The way in which you share it seems to be quite significant. Yeah,
absolutely. And those are the hardest moments is to share it without being defensive or guarding, or because usually what ends up happening is that you could say there's three main ways of moving away from intimacy, i.e., not tolerating anxiety. You could say one is I dominate, right? So like, instead of like risking and sharing, I'll just take over the situation and I'll just manage everything and like make sure that I can't hear anything and dominate the situation. Or the other one is I'll avoid the anxiety by just submitting. Okay, well, do whatever you want, right? Like, I'll I'll just like kind of deny even have any, I want anything. We'll just do whatever you want. Or the other one is to dissociate, right? And or stay and
What's the
open up to it and
disassociation
share
look
and
like?
grow. Oh, that's kind of like usually where you don't even know. It's like dissociation is usually like you don't even know that you're feeling something or that there's something to share, right? Like if you do something that bothers me, I won't even feel the hurt that's there because I'm dissociated, right? Or numb. So it's more like floating up on the ceiling, you know, or being super, super agreeable or something like that, or just not even knowing that I want anything.
Mm. And sorry, the
That could be
last
a
one, I
kind of
interrupted you in the
dissociation.
middle of that. The last one was the way in which we're speaking about with this attunement. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. So like, so in moments of intimacy and risk, it's, and this was a big deal for me to kind of realize this, like not just with intimacy, but with anything in life, right? That you push into. I think on some level, I was trying to figure out how not to be scared in order to be intimate, right? Or how not to figure out how not to be afraid of like and anxious. So then I can then be intimate, or then I can then do the thing. But when I really started to get like, no, actually, it has nothing to do with not feeling afraid. It has everything to do with actually tolerating anxiety and telling the truth undefendedly and opening to the other radically, right? And letting go is the whole thing, right? It's your ability to tolerate anxiety. And that was huge for me because I realized like in order to try to like do it the other way is similar to kind of sitting on the dock looking at the water trying to figure out how to jump in without getting wet, right? You can think you can figure out how to do that, but if you really think that, right, you can sit out there forever. But if you realize like, oh no, you can't do it, right? You could just like get up and start living your life or just jump in and get wet.
Yeah. I always think of it as a like kind of coming to dance when the music's on and
Yeah.
not moving into that flow of dance. The music will end sooner or later and the opportunity will be over. So it's like, do
Yeah.
you move in or not? And yeah,
Right.
moving in is like a thing. Letting go, moving in, and seeing how it unfolds. You know, seeing how moving into that fear, what develops from that, because there's a risk, but and the equal opposite side of that, there's a potential for the deepest sense of beauty as well to emerge.
Totally.
Mm.
And I think that's also really true with anything that we do. Like you just remember, you could probably think back to your first podcast, right?
Mm.
Like you're probably nervous about it. Like anything that usually are things that we end up feeling proud of are usually have a lot to do with, you know, like risking at that level and doing it anyways and walking through that. That's how we kind of develop as people. And the same thing is, I think, in relationships and intimacy, right? So, in other words, it's kind of like there's another level of like, it'd be really interesting, you know, if you felt up to what could unfold with that is be like, you know what, I want to know you, but everything that you're saying so far, I've heard from 10 other people already today. So like, tell me who you are. Otherwise, I'm going to just keep feeling bored. But I'm willing to sit here. Like, you can be real with me,
Yeah, so it's
right?
like dropping that bomb of of realness, just sharing what you feel. I guess, yeah, I just guess the only thing that comes up is not wanting to hurt the other person's feelings and doing that delicately
Totally,
and with skill. Yeah,
totally,
yeah,
totally.
yeah.
And here's the thing: is like, ultimately, right? If you really, I think the key part, right? And it's all about attunement, right? Is as long as your intention is to relate, right? If your intention is really to relate, you can kind of bumblefuck your way through it. And at the end of the day, I think the intention actually probably is the guiding factor,
Mm.
right? Like it may hurt their feelings, But if you really want to relate, you can get interested in how that hurts. And you can kind of like, oh, there's a way I could have said that more, right? And it could be actually lead to a moment of deeper connection for both of you, right? In that sense. I would say as long as you're willing to hang out with whatever it opens up, right? With an open heart. Like as long as you're willing to do that, right? I don't think you can really go wrong.
Mm.
But there's a sense of that, right? You could say the opposite intention of relating is trying to control, right? And that's more like idle talk, right? Where and this is kind of like this is what we practice not doing in circling, right? And is what makes it kind of difficult is because a lot of times, when we talk with people without knowing it, it's coming from an intention to, I'm in other words, I'm saying what I'm saying, not saying what I'm not saying it in the way that I'm not saying it, so that I can like assure a certain outcome, right? So to make sure I know that like that you'll like me and accept me. I'll only say the things that you'll like and accept, right? And essentially that comes from a position of control, right? But it's funny, the moment you kind of let that go and you just are honest, right? Openly honest without guard, it's you can feel it is the moment you want access directly to the unknown and aliveness. All you got to do is do that. Right? And you'll have no idea what's going to happen next.
Mm.
Mm.
Are you open to sharing a bit more about how people can get in touch with your work and if they want to deepen their
Right,
understanding
yeah.
of circling? Or are you doing, you mentioned the thing with Viveki recently and the
Mhm.
reenactment of this platonic process. Is there anything else that you want to kind of bring our attention to? And
Sure.
I'd be curious to know as well as the listeners, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, what's cool is, I mean, COVID, we just put everything online, and like that has actually worked surprisingly well. I didn't do anything online with circling. Everything was in the Bay Area. People have to fly in,
Mm.
but now everything that we do, anyone can come to because it's all on Zoom, and it works surprisingly well. So a few different ways to participate. The company that I co-founded and co-own is the Circling Institute. And
Okay.
it's simply circlinginstitute.com. And we have like every Thursday we have an open drop-in event that's open to anybody. It's like $20. It's on Thursday night, 6 to 9. On Thursdays, Pacific Standard Time and California time. Um, every once a month we usually have an intensive weekend, like a circling weekend that goes on for 6 to 8 hours, 2 days straight. And that's we usually have one of those every month to 6 weeks. And then the main thing that I've been doing for years is a practitioner training called the Art of Circling. And that is I think it's a 9 month training program. It consists of like 8 or 9 weekends where we go through the stages of circling, and each weekend focuses on a particular stage, and we train in learning how to facilitate and become a practitioner. And then we have level 2s and level 3s, and we have all kinds of stuff, advanced stuff after that. But those are the first 3 layers of involvement to get involved with. I also do, I work one-on-one with people. So you can just email me, Sengstock@gmail.com as well. And then I have a YouTube channel. I mean, you've seen that where I basically talk a lot to, I mean, one of the things we didn't go that deep into, but I mentioned a little bit, but I mean, philosophy and reading Martin Heidegger and has been a huge part of my life in a surprising way.
What are your access points to Heidegger? Because everything I've found is like in a different language and just some rough subtitles. Has he written some
Yeah.
interesting books or anything in that area?
Heidegger, man, he's difficult to break directly into yourself. Give you some thought about. I mean, that's what I tried to do. I started off reading Being in Time, and I spent 3 months obsessively reading that and not understanding a thing it was saying. But
Yeah.
something else important was going on as I was grappling with it too. That was very, very,
Yeah.
very deep for me. Yeah, just I would say I'd have to think. I have to get back with you on some secondary sources with Heidegger.
Yep.
But he's definitely a life changer.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, thank you
Nice to
so
meet you,
much.
my friend.
Yeah,
Good talking with you.
it's been good. Yeah, I can imagine just picturing your life and all these different interactions and relationships that come about through what you do. It's such a beautiful thing, and
Yeah.
it's been beautiful to, share this space and time with one another.
Yeah. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode with Guy. If you want more information on his work, head over to the website, todaydreamer.com, and there'll be notes in the show notes section. There'll also be a link in the description where you can get in touch with Guy and see more of his work and get into circling a little bit deeper if you've found it interesting. As always, thank you so much for being a part of this journey. And if you want to deepen that journey, head over to the support page at patreon.com/todaydreamer, where in exchange for your support of the show, I'll be providing special perks and benefits for my most loyal listeners. Until next time, be well, and there's plenty of great conversations that I've had recently that I'm going to be releasing in the coming weeks. So please stay tuned for those. They're coming out weekly, and let's really take what we're learning from these conversations and spread them outwards through the way that we live our lives. In the meantime, be well, and I don't know what else to say. Yeah, be well.